What is up, everybody? Welcome to our new little podcast that we're going to be doing. We're going to go ahead and call it Source Sauce. So this is episode 1. Just going to go ahead and give her a try, see what's going to happen, alright? So today we're going to be talking about Chernobyl, the Cold War, and possibly tossing a couple conspiracy theories in there. We'll see how it goes. Today we got some guests along with us. We got my man Reese. He's kind of our Chernobyl expert. He spent like a year just going ham on researching this stuff. Alright, and then we got another good friend of ours, Ray, or Raymond, whatever you like. Ray Money is what I call him, but you do what you want. Alright, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get straight into it. So, Fiki, you're a bit of a Chernobyl man, right?
Yeah.
Alright, bro, so let's go ahead and give us a little bit of backstory of Chernobyl.
Alright, so Chernobyl, it's this disaster that happened during the late 80s. Was it 1986 is when it happened. So basically, the entire thing was during the height of the Cold War, as you may know from the whole time frame and everything. It was at a nuclear power plant, one of Russia's supposedly finest power plants. The workers there didn't know anything. Like all they knew was that it was Russia's best, so they trusted in the machinery more than they trusted in themselves, which jointly led to this disaster. So what happened was, in the early morning hours, they were testing the reactor in a low power situation. The power dipped below minimum levels for the test, and they had pulled the control rods out of the water, and the water is what regulates the temperature of the control rods, basically. So, everything starts to go wrong, so they push this emergency button. I can't quite remember what it's called. I used to know what it was called. But anyway, what this button does is it pushes the control rods back into the water. But it doesn't do it quickly, and they didn't know this. So the first thing that went in are the tips, and they are graphite tips, and that's where most of the heat sinks are, is like right in the tip. So it was an immense release of steam and pressure, and the reactor was faulty, and it wasn't built as well as today's reactors. So the entire lid of the reactor, which would be reactor number 4, blew completely off through the roof and landed like 2 or 3 miles away from the power station. Keep in mind, this lid is at least 2 or 3 feet of solid lead, so that's quite a bit of weight. You factor in that's probably like 60, 70 tons of lead that just got blown sky high. So these reactors, the control rods, are obviously extremely radioactive because they're made out of plutonium, uranium, so on and so forth. I don't know a whole bunch about the reactor itself, I just know it was faulty. It went on for about 3 days before they decided to evacuate. The Russian scientists and politicians were disagreeing because the Russian scientists had teams go out there and check the radiation levels, and they were way, way above normal radiation levels. The control room Geiger counter, which is what measures the radiation levels, only read, was it like 3.5? And that's as far as it goes. So the politicians were taking that reading and saying everything was okay, when in reality it was in the 100,000s as far as that goes. And so during this 3-day period, there is this town near to the power plant that was called Pripyat, and there were several thousand people that lived in Pripyat. It was like a miniature New York City, essentially. And all these people were just sitting there soaking in the radiation. It was summertime, so everybody was outside. Nobody had any idea the amount of toxicity that was going into their bodies at that point. So, in my mind, I think politicians could have done a way better job of notifying the public, but because of the fact that we were in the middle of a Cold War, they didn't want to admit the fact that one of the best nuclear reactors had just blown up due to a small issue that would have otherwise been simple to fix. But the radiation release traveled throughout Europe, and they had to clean the air. They had to scrub Pripyat completely, and even now it's one of the most radioactive places in the entire world.
Wow. So something that big, and you said there was quite a few people in that one town.
Mm-hmm.
Were there any casualties that went along with this?
My study of this was a few years ago. I know it was in the several thousands, and there are also several 100,000 that are undocumented, simply due to the fact that the radiation was so widespread. I'll go into detail about the first responders. The firemen had no idea that the control rods were exposed, and so they were trying to fight it like a normal fire, and all the water would do would create steam, which releases more radioactive material into the atmosphere. And while they were putting out the fires, this steam was getting to them. And while they have regulators and stuff on, it doesn't protect against radiation. It only protects against particles in the air. Radiation, what radiation poisoning does to you is it breaks down the atoms that make up your body, so your cells begin to deteriorate and break apart as radiation sickness goes on. So every single one of the firemen that was there to put out the fire that day succumbed to radiation sickness within the first 2 weeks, and the ones that survived 2 weeks were lucky. The ones that were directly on top, spraying water down into the reactor, were the unlucky ones, and they only survived about 2 to 3 days.
So the majority of the first responders, or all of them?
Yes, almost every single one of them is dead, and if they are not dead or did not die right off the bat, they suffered from thyroid cancer, because that's the first thing that absorbs all the radiation is your thyroid, and the thyroid regulates everything in your body, and creates tons and tons of problems, of course, because when the thing that regulates your body is out of whack, that's obviously going to be bad.
Yeah. So, did the, as you were saying about the firefighters or the first responders not knowing about the exposed, what would you say, exposed
Control rods.
Control rods. So, was there any way that they could have done anything better, maybe make it to where there wasn't as much radiation in the air, or was it just as soon as the thing popped off, it was pretty much over?
As soon as the lid popped off, the control rods are exposed and there's radiation leaking into the atmosphere, and due to the fact that it was summer, it was a hot day, airspeed is moving pretty quickly, and once it gets up into the atmosphere, there's no telling what it can do. As far as what they did with trying to prevent it, during the first 3 days before they told the public about this, they were attempting to snuff out the fire, and what they did was they took Russian helicopters over top of the reactor, and they poured sand out of the helicopters and dropped sandbags over the side on top of the control rods, considering that water was not working. All this did because the control rods at this point were so hot they were molten. it just created a gigantic lava ball, and it kept melting into the ground. And mind you, there's just solid ground and concrete underneath the reactor, so it's not like this is like maybe a few hundred degrees. This is several thousand degrees, probably close to the temperature of the sun at this point, but also releasing all this radiation. So they get it snuffed out up top, but what they don't realize is that it's still burning into the ground. And underneath of the reactor, a few hundred feet down, there's this water reservoir that it's got a couple thousand gallons of water in it, right? So they find this out, the scientists do, because they're constantly trying to figure out how to put this out, how to resolve the situation before it gets any worse. And what would happen if the control rods, this molten ball of metal, radioactive material, reached the reservoir, because it was man-made, it would act as almost an atomic bomb. As far as that goes, it would be 2 to 3 times worse than the bombs detonated at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So they had to formulate a plan to figure this out, how to solve it. So the only way in is to dive into the water reservoir. Well, the water reservoir is already radioactive because it's a reservoir for the reactor, right? So it's already extremely radioactive. The only way in is a man-made entrance, and small enough for a man to get in and release the water from the reservoir so it doesn't cause such a huge explosion. What it was a suicide mission, essentially. One Russian diver sacrificed his life to go in there, release the water, avoiding a bigger explosion. And I don't remember the guy's name. I really wish I did. But such an honorable thing to do. Just give your life to save thousands and countless others. And that's kind of how they put it out. Basically, was just letting it burn out. And what's left there now is what they call the elephant's foot. And it's just a ball of metal made of nothing but the control rods, and it is still extremely radioactive to this day. So they had to put a sarcophagus over the top, which is just basically a tin metal shed with lead lining the outside of it. And as a matter of fact, I think a few years ago, or maybe even this year, they were having to rebuild it because the sarcophagus that was remade in the early 2000s was falling apart and rusting, because obviously you can't get people out there to maintain it because it's so radioactive.
I might add, I was watching this history show, and I was watching, and as Reese said, they put a sarcophagus over it in the early 2000s, but now the radiation, since the sarcophagus is like deteriorating from the radiation and stuff, they put a bigger sarcophagus that almost covers the entire plant, rather than the first one that just covered reactor 4, but now they put a new sarcophagus on it that just covers the entire plant. And if the radiation is going to go on for a long time, so they're just going to have to keep on putting bigger and bigger sarcophaguses over top of the existing ones, because there's no other way to confine the radiation from Chernobyl.
Yeah, exactly. So as of right now, the town of Pripyat, like I said, they scrubbed it relatively clean, but the radiation levels are still slightly above normal. You can go to that abandoned town. It's not considered very lawful, though. If the Russian police catch you out there, you can get detained and or arrested, because there are certain places you can go legally, but if you want to explore the town, you are going to have to go kind of how would you say, above or below the law. I don't know. You're going to have to make some not so legal shortcuts. So yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful place because it just kind of shows how nature takes over after mankind has had their way, because there are like huge vines and even trees growing inside of buildings now because of how long it's been left. And even when you think about it, it's only been like 40, 50 years since this happened, but it's still extremely radioactive, and nature's kind of taken over. And there are actually some mutations to the animals that live there due to the fact that there is such a high radiation dose there.
What kind of mutations would that?
Even the stuff that you see out of comic books, like two-headed frogs and stuff like that. And there are even people like farmers and stuff who lived there for their entire lives that still live in what they call the exclusion zone, which is the area of irradiated land, so to speak. And they live there, but it creates many health side effects. Their children are born deformed, even though it may not be due to incest, but their children are born deformed without certain body parts, sometimes extra body parts and stuff like that. And people will go there to hunt the mutated boar and stuff around there, and sometimes they're larger than normal, sometimes they have mutated parts like extra legs and stuff like that. It's kind of wild.
So, I know it's like hard to tell or whatever, but has there ever been like any approximations on when the majority of the radiation will be gone from the actual plant itself?
The majority of the radiation will be dissipated in probably 50 more years or so. So in total, about 100 years since the disaster happened, it will be possible to visit the site without too much harm. I mean, as of right now, if you visit, you only want to stay for about 3 or 4 hours. That way the radiation does not get to you and cause your thyroid to become enlarged or cause health side effects.
Hi, Devlin, the sound guy here. Do you think it's possible that the government could have caused Chernobyl?
I mean, I guess there are conspiracy theories about that, but at the same time, you gotta think, this is the height of the Cold War, right? They want Russia to look strong, not weak. So if anything, you could think that maybe Western spies or maybe countries that Russia weren't so friendly with during the Cold War times could have sabotaged it. But then again, at the same time, it's simply explained by just negligence with the systems and stuff. They should have stayed within parameters. And even the, what would you say, the technicians on site that were running the test, the manager had an idea of how it worked, but he had no idea of the possible side effects or problems that could be caused by dipping too low below the power level. And by the way, all the men in the control room of Reactor 4 are now deceased due to the fact that they had an overdose on radiation. They died within, let's say, a week and a half of everything conspiring.
So, going back to the death inside there, was there anybody that died from like? Because I assume since the explosion, was there like you said there was fire. Mm-hmm. Was there anybody that was there that like died because of the blast or necessarily the radiation?
Yeah, there are technicians that sort of walk the floor of the reactor, and if they need to, they'll check on the stability of the rods and everything. They have lead vests and everything for that. And there were like 2 or 3 men walking on the lid of Reactor 4 when this happened, and you can kind of assume that they were probably obliterated in the blast.
So, like, were they obliterated, or they just kind of fly off with the lid, or?
Well,
Pretty-
their
it's pretty
bodies
heavy.
weren't their bodies weren't really ever found. They just notified the families that they were most likely deceased because nobody can really survive that. Not to mention, afterwards, the underside of the lid is extremely radioactive as well.
Yeah.
So,
Like, where did they end up finding, like, the lid, or did they ever find it?
well, like I said, they found it like, I don't know if it was necessarily miles away, but it was a few hundred feet away at least. But I mean, for a several ton lid made out of nothing but lead and steel, that's quite a bit of weight, and it must have been an extremely high pressure explosion, because it was the steam explosion that caused it.
So there had to have been, like, an outrageous amount of, like, pressure, because I'm sure the lids have some sort of, like, locking device so that if there is pressures, they don't blow off. But this had to have, like, the pressure in the reactor had to have been, like, extreme, because for how many ever ton lid to just blow off and probably had some sort of locking mechanism, that blast has got to be very, very powerful, and the pressure in there is just outrageous.
Yeah, actually the lid was not meant to come off like a lid. It was, it had individual slots. It was literally just the top of the reactor. It was in several feet of concrete, very, very dense. And, so they had a locking, not locking mechanism. They had individual slots for the rods to go in, and they would, I'm pretty sure they had a crane overhead that they could put the rods in individually and everything. But yeah, I mean the top of the reactor wouldn't really be called a lid, but it was just the top of the reactor. It was connected to everything else. The explosion was so great that it dislodged all this lead and concrete and steel from whatever connecting members they were, shot it up into the sky.
Pretty crazy. Alright, so kind of just segueing into the war here. You know a lot about the war, so let's see here, like, what kind of started the war, and then how did Chernobyl kind of affect the later
Stages of the war.
yeah, stages, or the outcome, or
Okay, well, the war, dare I almost say that it was kind of the fault of both the United States and Russia, due to the fact that the United States had developed a nuclear weapon, and so the Russians wanted the same thing, because we were like the top two superpowers at the time. And so the United States did not like the idea of communism, and you can see that with the Red Scare in, I think, in like the 1930s, before, or like right at the beginning of World War II. Everybody was scared of communists. You know, they viewed them as monsters and everything. Yeah, just kind of like Nazis, or like the way the German military was before World War II, like during World War I. And so anyway, it's just a bunch of scare tactics and propaganda. But I guess we were probably more scared of the Russians than we should have been. I mean, neither of us were stupid enough to launch nukes at each other.
yeah.
It was just kind of like, whose stick is bigger, who can swing it better, yada yada yada, back and forth, you know. Who had more sticks, you know. it just kind of started from a fear of communism and the communist fear of capitalism, basically. I mean, the idea of communism was pretty taboo, considering 90% of communists were atheists. And at the time, the United States was hugely Christian, and everybody went to church on Sunday. It didn't matter if you really believed or not, you always went to church on Sunday, or else you were pretty much exiled from the community.
Yeah.
You know? So, it's just kind of our fear of change and everything. I'm not saying that communism's good in any respect, because giving one person or the government all the power is a bad idea, no matter, like, even if you're living in an almost perfect society, human traits kind of lean towards greed and everything, and when you can have everything and give everybody else the shorter end of the stick, of course most people are going to do that, unless you're like, you know, a sane human being. But yeah,
have
so
nothing when you can have everything.
yeah, exactly. It's it was kind of silly, the Cold War, just meaningless confrontations and stuff that could have been avoided if it were just simply for slightly more open minds. If we would just, you know, as long as it's not coming to the United States, we're not being threatened by it, it's no big deal, you know. So I didn't really see the point in the Cold War. It is interesting to study, though. Like with the Cuban Missile Crisis and everything, like, well, maybe I should backtrack a bit. The Korean War and all the conflicts up until now were due to the fear of communism spreading to the United States. The war with Korea, which isn't talked about very much. I'm not super educated with the war in Korea. I know it was similar to Vietnam. It was classified as a police action. You know, we still had military over there. We fought, and as most Americans view it, just because we pulled out, we lost. You know, even though if we were in there, like, head to the point, like, we probably would have won. But anyway, it was fought just because we were scared of communism and we were in fear of it coming to the United States. And then after that, the Vietnam War was the same sort of deal. And I think as far as on the side of democracy, we chose probably the worst leader in southern Vietnam to be associated with, just simply because he was not powerful. He didn't speak out as much as the North Korean leader, which is the side of communism, obviously. He was more, the North Korean leader was more outspoken. What was his name? Ho Chi Minh.
Okay.
I think so. Hence the name Ho Chi Minh Trail. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so anyway, he was more outspoken, so the people liked him more, and he could twist things like, you know, like if North Koreans were to attack a small village or something, he could say, hey, the Americans, or, you know, since, not to be racist or anything, but, like, when they wore their uniforms, they were quite similar, and, you know, like, they don't know every individual in the military and stuff like that, so they could frame it on South Vietnam. Maybe not so much the Americans, because we had official battle dress and everything.
Yeah.
But they could blame it on the South Vietnamese and then get more people to fight for the cause. And they would fight to the death because they believed so heartily in what they were doing. Even though they were killing small children, raping women, you know, all that sort of bad tyrannical stuff you hear about all the time. It's just being able to swindle your words like that. It's so simple to paint somebody as the bad guy, even if they aren't. because all we were trying to do was like aid them, help them, try to get them on the side of democracy so they can choose their own path.
Yeah.
That's the whole thing. We were trying to peacekeep, but it just didn't turn out so well. We didn't have full military authority over there because, again, it was a police action. And so a lot of our guys got killed out there just because they had to... There were stricter rules of engagement, you know, due to the fact that it was only a police action. And as is soldiers, American soldiers, were being slandered in the news, saying that they're baby killers and all this and that, when in actuality there were North Vietnamese soldiers rigging babies to blow up, like literally strapping bomb vests to them, and the mother would cry for help, so the soldiers would come to help the mother and the child, and while they were administering aid, the North Vietnamese would sit somewhere with a remote control, and boom, you know. And yeah, it is, honestly. They would do literally anything for their ideals. And I think at some point you gotta realize, you know, what you're doing. You're killing your own people, right? And killing people, first off, isn't very right. I get if you're doing it to defend yourself, but it's not when you're murdering people in the name of communism, or in the name of any sort of religion, or what would you say?
Ideologies.
Yeah, ideology. It's just plain wrong. You can't blame your craziness on the facts or on the basis of an ideology. And that's where communism, for me, I don't think it's a very good idea. Even socialism, which hides behind the name socialism, but is indeed a branch of communism.
Yeah.
Democratic socialism, and it's not a bad idea, but we'll get into that later. Yeah, so basically, communism doesn't work in countries without very much money. And I don't think it'll ever work even with countries that have money, because if you have money and there's a possibility to get more, you're always going to do that.
Yep.
So then that turns to corruption and everything. And that's what the Cold War was about. America was trying to be the world police after World War II. And up until like the late 80s, when we got into Desert Storm and all that, trying to fight terrorism and stuff like that, I can't remember the exact date it was that the Cold War ended. I just remember there was actually a misinterpreted message from, I think it was like a Russian news source, that they had announced that they were going to take down the wall, and Reagan went on air, and that's where the famous phrase goes something like, "Gorbachev, take down that wall." Gorbachev was the Russian president.
Okay.
And then so started the fall of the Soviet Union. It broke apart, and I'm not exactly sure what government they have now, because I'm not so up to speed as far as modern Russian politics goes. I will point out, for those of you who believe socialism will work, look at Ukraine, and this was in, what was it, 2013, right?
Yeah.
So in 2013, a Russian president, this was democratic socialism, by the way, for those of you who might think it could be a different sort of socialism or communism or something. Communism hides behind the face of socialism. It's just a stupid idea. So anyway, this Russian president, because they had democratic socialism, again, hiding in the face of socialism, he had his own ideals, he believed in the old Soviet Union, and the Russian people did not want to be a part of Russia. They did not want to be in ties with Russia. They were tired of it. They wanted to be with the European Union. So the people were asking for a vote to join the European Union so they could become a democracy rather than democratic socialism, because the leaders of the country have too much power in democratic socialism. And any type of socialism at all, you're giving too much power to the government, and you're relying on the government to pay for everything that you need, when in fact they can pocket that money and just spend it on things they want, or to in the pursuit of becoming the most powerful country in the world. So anyway, this guy, the people are calling for a vote. The vote gets passed by a majority. Like 95% of the people want to join the European Union, right? So the president's like, okay, all right, we'll join the European Union. He vetoes it, right? Because he's got ties with Russia, and he's trying to make a deal with Putin at this point. So the people of Ukraine begin to protest in the streets, and he sees this as no good at all. So he sends the police out there, and this is where the only real police brutality in my mind comes out. They started beating the peacefully protesting citizens with batons, and they were actually advised to use their metal batons rather than the rubber ones, so that they could do more damage to deter them from protesting.
So instead of acting like police, they just became brutal thugs.
Essentially, yes.
That's messed up.
Yeah. So, anyway, this goes on. The president is like, okay, we'll have another vote with the governing body, and again it passes by majority. Again, he vetoes it. The people protest. He sends his private police force, Russian mobsters, basically, to this protest, and they start beating the protesters again. And then the protesters fall back to a sanctuary. I can't quite remember the name of it. It was like a mosque, or no, it wasn't a mosque. It was like what would you call it? It was Catholic.
Chapel?
Yeah, it was like a chapel, basically, and the religious leaders there helped them and gave them food and everything, and medicine for those who were injured. And so they make this base. They make a fence out of wooden pallets, car tires, literally anything they could find. They would take like signs and like the barricades that the Russian police turned mobsters used against them. They took them and built basically a wall. And so anyway, at this point, the Russian police are like, screw it. We're going to start using rubber bullets on them. So after a while of using rubber bullets, these people are very strong-willed. They believe in what they want, and they're going to get it come hell or high water. So anyways, they're shooting them with rubber bullets. They shrug these off. Obviously, they hurt a lot, but their pride is much stronger than their bodies. So basically, the Russian police, I wouldn't use the word police because this was like the president's special police.
Basically his thugs.
We'll call it the Ukrainian SS, basically. So the Ukrainian SS, they decide to mix their rubber bullets with buckshot, 50-50.
Which is a live round.
Yeah, buckshot's a live round for those of you who don't know a whole bunch about guns. So anyways, they're firing the rubber bullets, and they figure that they're still rubber bullets because people were falling down and stuff like they were before, but they started to realize they're not getting back up, and they're bleeding and dying, basically. So they fall back to this chapel, right? this goes on for several weeks.
Months even.
Yes, months even. And finally, they reach a turning point, and the Ukrainian president resigns due to the fact that 95% of the people do not want him in the office. He resigns, flies back to Russia. That's a conspiracy theory that he flies back to Russia, but nobody knows where he went.
Does anybody know where he's at now?
I guarantee you he's in Russia, but that's what I believe. So anyway, there is still a small population that believes that Ukraine should have ties to Russia. And ever since 2013 up until now, as of today, Ukraine is still fighting a vicious civil war against what I would say is communism, what sympathizers would say is democratic socialism.
Which makes me wonder, like, because people's lives, they were taken from them fighting for trying to take away democratic socialism or communism,
Yeah.
or whatever you want to say. So, here in America, with like Bernie Sanders, AOC, and those of the
Yeah.
like, are trying to push for democratic socialism. I just think, like, who are we to say it will work when people have died fighting against it whenever they've lived in a state of democratic socialism or communism?
I would like to point out also, just because I am a huge Second Amendment advocate, the people of Ukraine were not legally allowed to own weapons. They were disarmed by the government, and when the police began shooting at them, they were unarmed. They had nothing but bricks to throw. And a brick may hurt and even cause some serious damage, but a gunshot wound is irreversible.
I mean,
And
brick
with the
probably
trained,
wouldn't do anything. They had armor on.
well, they had armor on, but I mean that's besides the point.
Not to mention there's a range on a gun with a brick. You can only throw it as hard as
Yeah.
as you can.
They were literally, they had snipers out there. They had the Russian SS out there with AK-47s just firing into crowds. It's literally, it's just murder. That's all it is. It's honestly, it's a war crime, I think. Honestly, and I think they should all be condemned and sentenced to life in prison for what they've done. Maybe even, what would you say? Capital punishment.
I second that.
Say like the electric chair.
There you go.
Can I just say something real quick to anyone who's out in Ukraine? I hope that you soon get the freedom and stuff that you deserve. I'm not really good with speeches, but, you know.
Yeah.
Let's just take a little quick moment for the people who died in the war in Ukraine.
Yep.
Shout out to all the people out there fighting the good fight.
Yeah. We wish them luck.
And as Americans, personally, I will do what I can to make it to where those who have died in the name of
Fighting against communism.
fighting against
Freedom.
fighting in the name of freedom.
I was gonna say fighting against
I
freedom
will-
don't sound good.
I will do my best to do what I can to make it to where they did not die in vain.
I agree.
And another thing about socialism, communism, democratic socialism, you are promised free stuff. With all this stuff, it's propaganda. And
Let's be honest, you're never gonna see any of that stuff.
and if we are being completely honest, you always hear the phrase, if it's too good to be true, it's too good to be true.
Yeah, honestly, especially with greed. There's always somebody that's going to be greedy, and even if it works for a year or two,
Venezuela.
even democratic socialism, there will be a new leader who can turn on a dime. Okay, they can say all this and that, but nothing says in a book that they have to do exactly what they say they're going to do. And we've seen that in the past with presidents like Barack Obama. Yeah, and Hitler promised all this prosperity to his people and his followers, and lied straight to their face, saying that he was not outright killing Jewish people, when indeed he was killing millions.
And, like, yeah, going along with Hitler, like, he was killing all the Jews, but, like, he was even killing some of his own people, the Germans, because basically all the mentally disabled and anybody that couldn't work or were twins, they did experiments on and killed them and put them in the euthanasia programs.
Literally, even homosexual people were being killed and stuff. It's ridiculous. So, anyway, the Cold War, in conclusion, is a little ridiculous, but at the same time, I can sympathize with the American viewpoint that communism in any situation is not good. And what we were trying to do, which was noble, but maybe a little bit out of reach, was trying to give the American dream to people in other countries. But anyway, I leave you with that thought. I mean, what do you think about socialism? Honestly, I mean, in what world do you think it could work, or maybe you agree with us and explain why?
Subscribe, leave a like if you can, and maybe hit that bell if you wouldn't mind. See y'all next episode on Source Sauce.